Good morning, everybody. I'm Nik Gowing. That's a relief. At least I don't have to shout to the back of the hall. I'm standing here because we want to make this feel as informal as possible. This feels formal because of the nature of the setting and so on, but this is an Inception meeting. It's not a summit. And the aim is to hear as much from you as from those up here on the panel. We have microphones, and this is not just something which is going to happen quietly and diplomatically at the end. I'd like you to feel that you can engage right from the get-go. And that's why I'm standing here rather than sitting on that chair, because I'd like you to feel that you can contribute. You're in the business of helping set the agenda, help us understand some of the uncertainties we've just heard about from the chair, the troubling environment in which we're working in the global economy at the moment. And he did say right at the end, expecting a breadth of participation. So all I can do is encourage. But there are microphones. It is on the record, but there are microphones, and we need to hear your voices as well as the experts up here on the platform, and see it in that spirit. This first session will be probably about an hour and a half. Then we're going to have coffee break or orange or whatever you want to drink. Then we're going to move on. Linda Yu will join us and take my position and talk more specifically about the B20. But first, we want to talk about the G20 and the current global economic issues, the global economic uncertainty. And that's what's going to be challenging us, not just here in this room, but globally as well in so many of our nations. So please see it as a spirit of getting engaged, as opposed to you just listening to a panel for the next couple of hours. So let me just introduce who's joined us. Most of them have flown in literally a matter of 2 or 3 hours ago, so they're pretty sprightly given the length and the distance that they've flown. Ken Rogoff, who is from Harvard University, the Thomas Cabot Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Economics. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you.
Willem Buiter, who is visiting professor at Columbia University, but former global chief economist at CitiBank. And Mohamed El-Erian, who is chief economist and advisor at Allianz in Munich, although based in the Pacific, on the Pacific Rim. So those are our three guest and expert speakers. And what I want to hear from them, right from the get-go, is the scale of uncertainty. How do we define the scale of uncertainty? And what's coming? How uncertain is it going to be? I'm doing a big project about thinking unthinkables. And I think that's what we have to do today. Do we feel comfortable about the state of business and the prospects for business? Or is there much worse to come? Can the system in any way at least provide a firewall around the uncertainty that we're all facing, whether in central banks or wherever? So that's the spirit. There are 4 microphones, and I'll be able to see you right at the back as well, because I'll be helped on that. So please do think of offering your thoughts right from this first stage. Ken Rogoff, let me come to you, and let me go through this quite quickly with each of you. How do you define the level of uncertainty at the moment?
Thank you, Nick. If it's all right, I just want to start by thanking our hosts. When I worked as chief economist at the International Monetary Fund in the early 2000s, I represented the IMF in the deputy Sherpa G20 meetings. It was the early years. They were still thinking out how the forum would work, but I'm very pleased how important and successful the G20 has become. I think it's really has a very important role in the future of global governance. And also, I want to congratulate our hosts for this innovation of the B20. Really, the G20, you read about in the newspapers, the leaders meet at the end, and that gets a lot of coverage. But the way that the G20 is successful and impactful is through many other meetings that take place over the course of the year, and often requires a lot of leadership and direction on the part of the host country. And there have been many innovations over the years as it's evolved. So anyway, thank you again for having me. I mean, there are many points of uncertainty in the global economy today, but I can't get out of my head the one that emanates from my country, which is the uncertainty about global trade. And the US and China, of course, have reached an agreement that perhaps will last through the presidential election. But unfortunately, this is going to be a defining issue of the next 10 to 20 years, where the US and China are realigning their relationship. I don't think, no matter who wins the presidency in the next term in the United States, anything's going to change on this. They're still feeling this out. And it's a very difficult situation for business, because you don't know what's coming. You don't know what kind of barriers will be put up. You don't know what kind of rules. And of course, you could point to some of the very arbitrary actions that have been done, and that's very unfortunate. But I think the problem runs much deeper. Many of the benefits we've had, the growth, the inclusiveness, the incredible lowering of poverty in the world have come from globalization. And I'm afraid it's true that if you look over the centuries, there have been periods where globalization goes like this, and then it goes like this. And I certainly have fears about the latter. And I think it's very important for the G20 to play a role to try to mitigate this force, to try to channel it in a constructive direction. But this is a massive source of uncertainty, not just for the firms that are impacted by it, but also in finance. If you balkanize trade, you will balkanize finance to follow. So I could certainly list other flashpoints. I'll leave that to the panelists, but this is, particularly for the G20, it has a very important role to play in trying to mitigate this problem.
Thanks, Ken. Balkanizing trade and finance. That should underpin, I think, much of what we're going to talk about, both in this session and the next session. Mohamed, define the uncertainties as you're seeing them, please.
So I like the phrase. First, let me join Ken in thanking our host. And for me, it's a personal pleasure to be back in the kingdom and to see old friends and acquaintances. To capture the uncertainty you all face, whether you're in government, in business, whether you are thinking as a parent or as a leader, you can either go to Ben Bernanke's phrase of unusually uncertain or Mervyn King's phrase of radical uncertainty. It's not just uncertainty, it's uncertainty cubed. And the way I like to convey this is, imagine that we were here 4 years ago and we told you that the following is going to happen over the next 4 years. Ask yourself, what would you have thought of us? Ken would have said, in the next 4 years, the United States is going to go from the champion of free trade to the most protectionist advanced economy in the world. And the future of globalization itself will be in question. Willem would say, Germany, the powerhouse of Europe, is going to turn into the caboose of Europe, into recession, and is going to go through a very uncertain political transition at the very top. I would have said, in the course of 2019, $17 trillion of global bonds would trade at negative yields. People would lend their money and pay for the privilege of lending their money. With the exception of Ken's book, no book talked about the possibility of that happening. And the list goes on. These, to use Nik's word, were unthinkables. They've become reality. And that just illustrates to you the tectonic changes going on in the global economy that we're going to talk about. But it's already been happening, and that's why, Nik, to answer your question, I love the concept of unusually uncertain. Not just uncertain, but unusually uncertain.
Just to pick up on that point, though, do you reckon, and it's going to underpin everything we talk about in the next 3 hours, do you reckon many here and many elsewhere understand and grip the enormity of uncertainty?
I don't think so. I think there's a good reason why we don't. And I'll talk a little bit about behavioral science. Look, I was a CEO for a number of years. You are dealing with issues that have to do with your company. It's not easy to realize that it's not just about your house, but it's about the neighborhood. And there's certain things we assume about the neighborhood that are predictable. Trade patterns are predictable. The respect of the global rule of law is predictable. All these things have become unpredictable. And the natural inclination of people when they get taken out of their comfort zone is to find a way to get back into that comfort zone and deny what's happening. And I'll talk later about the very important insights that come from behavioral science. What people look at how business leaders make decisions under radical uncertainty. And the bottom line, Nick, is the probability of a mistake goes up significantly.
Thanks, Mohamed. Let me just re-emphasize, I want to come to you. So it's on your side to put up your hand, make sure that someone somewhere can see you're putting up your hand, and we can come to you to ask you what you think the level of uncertainty is and how comfortable you feel. And if you feel fantastically optimistic, let's hear that as well. Let's not all be doomsayers. But Ken, quickly, before I
just
go
wanted
to
to
them.
throw a question to my fellow panelist, Mohamed. So I share your view that there's qualitative uncertainty. There's so many things in the political process, climate events. I just came from Moscow where it's warm, unimaginably. And in Australia, they're having fires that are really economically impactful, cyber risk, many things. But if you look at markets, they're in a coma. They think there's no risk, that it moves like this, the stock market moves like this, all the standard models that your colleagues at Wharton look at would show that markets are expecting no risk. You were CEO at a major investment firm. What is going on? What's the disconnect?
I'm no longer surprised by markets being disconnected from reality. This has almost become the norm, especially, I would say, since the great financial crisis. Risk markets have singularly failed to price manifestly present risks. There's not even a risk. The reality of deglobalization started well before Trump. It started with the great financial crisis. The G20 got together in 2009, made a statement to avoid protectionism, and proceeded collectively to introduce several hundred protectionist measures since then. So there has been I think a marked absence of global leadership, and markets, unfortunately, partly driven, I think, by central bank encouraged risk denial, are whistling in the dark and refusing to recognize that the future is likely to be considerably darker than the present.
What do you mean by darker?
And I mean that the bifurcation in the global trading and financial system between the US and China will continue and deepen. If we get a second term for Mr. Trump, I think US against the rest of the world trade conflict will increase. If we don't get a second term for Mr. Trump, the geopolitical rivalry with China will, under any alternate administration, be present and manifest itself in increasingly disturbing and damaging ways. Trade restrictions, restrictions on capital flows, economic sanctions, and the breakup of established patterns of global interaction.
Do we have consensus here? I mean, there are two critical words we've already put on the agenda for you. A balkanization of trade and finance, and secondly, bifurcation. In other words, the pulling apart of the system. Do we have consensus here? Is dark the right word, or is this actually an opportunity? But is there a consensus? We have essentially balkanization and bifurcation going on. Mohamed.
What I think I certainly would agree with my colleagues is a slightly weaker variant of what you just said. And that is we have pressed the pause button on globalization. And there's a major question mark whether the next action is to press play again or whether we press rewind. But we have definitely pressed the pause button. And in doing so, we have done something else that has been avoided for a very long time. We have weaponized economic tools. This notion that you use economic tools not just for economic goals, but also for non-economic goals. And once you weaponize economic tools, it's actually very hard to go back. So that is where I think we are. And it raises the question of what happens next. Where I agree with my colleagues is that neither global trade nor global finance are wired for a world of deglobalization. They are wired for a world of globalization. So if indeed we are deglobalizing, we are going to have quite a bit of turbulence. Nik, later on I want to come back to what my colleagues said about markets, because I need to defend markets a little bit.
Okay, but let me press you about the play button and the pause button. Because in the end, when you have a play button, you press it on Spotify or on tape, if you still use tape, or on a cassette recorder or whatever, but the music still plays as it always was going to play. Do you believe it can return now to the way it has been and the way the music would have played on? Or are we talking about a complete reinvention and a complete recomposition of what is coming next?
So no doubt the future is going to look different in a certain way. One, if the US doesn't get what it seeks in terms of a fairer trade system, and a fairer trade system means resetting some of the rules of the game, then we are going to press rewind. Meanwhile, there are regional realities happening, the Belt and Road Initiative, so it will look different. But globalization has always evolved. If you ask me for probabilities, I will tell you there's a 25% probability we stay where we are now. And then the two tails, which have the higher probabilities, are tilted towards deglobalization. But I wouldn't tell you that it's a 80% chance of deglobalization. There's still a chance we can get back to globalization. And I think both the G20 and the B20, as Ken said, can play a role in this.
Let me just check, Willem and Ken, that idea of just being a pause at the moment on a play. Do you agree with that or not, Ken?
Well, I mean, I think we've done a bit of rewind in addition to the pause, and I think it's had an effect on investment. It's not just China that talking about putting tariffs on German cars, reworking trade agreements, and then above all, the World Trade Organization is on pause, and it can't be on pause. The kind of goods we have keeps changing. It needs to evolve. This is a crucial challenge. The World Trade Organization is designed around manufacturers, which is a lot of trade, but it's increasingly in services. I just wanted to mention one thing about the weaponization of trade, which is a good phrase. The U.S. has weaponized financial sanctions for a long time. I lose track, but I think we have the United States financial sanctions on 35 different entities at the moment, 12 countries. And the United States at some point decided this worked. I don't know that it actually does work that well, but the idea of weaponizing trade and not allowing globalization to proceed is very fundamental, because I think trade helps reduce frictions. It provides common interests. People, meet and communicate. There's plenty of evidence, and nothing's black and white, but there's plenty of evidence that countries that trade are more likely to resolve their conflicts. They have self-interest. So if we go into a pause and a regression on global trade, it has, I think, a lot of deeper problems.
Willem, let me just ask you again. Pause, rewind. How would you define it?
I think we are in rewind mode. There's no doubt about it. The gains from globalization have been distributed so unequally that the support political for globalization in many of the advanced countries now is weaker than it has been since the last great wave of globalization started. And I think we've been in retreat since at least 2009. We're not just weaponizing trade, the United States, it has weaponized all other forms of economic sanctions. And we see that in this rivalry for global dominance between the ascending hegemon, China, and the hegemon in relative decline, the US, is in that rivalry, economics, trade, other economic dimensions, FDI, capital movements, intellectual property, tech transfer, all these things, and strategic considerations are a seamless web. The US threatened Mexico with trade sanctions in order to achieve immigration objectives. We are going to see trade sanctions imposed for reasons that have nothing to do with trade or even wider economic conflict. It could be that disagreements about Taiwan between the US and China lead to trade sanctions or economic sanctions being imposed. It could be that disenchantment about China's attitude towards Iran may lead to economic sanctions being imposed. This is the new reality. I think we are in full retreat from globalization.
Full retreat.
Yes.
Right. Does anyone want to come in? Are we being too pessimistic? I hope we're being realistic, but you may want to tell us, actually, I've got a better idea. Now, someone would like to come in. I've got 2 microphones already. Please get the microphone, choose yourselves, and let's hear from you. And please, will you introduce yourselves? Because I have to say I can't see you. Microphone to the middle. Please, introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Scott Hansen, representing the International Federation of Accountants. In all of this, its focus has squarely been on trade, markets, things to that effect, with globalization in pause or rewind. I think, though, it's fair to say that at a societal level, globalization is happening faster than ever. So we have this disjunct between trade, markets, etc., and what people are like. Someone born in Riyadh today, New York, Shanghai, their lives are going to be more similar than ever before. And that trend is just going to keep happening further and further, social media, things like that. How do you see these two, sort of the deglobalization of trade and the hyperglobalization of society? Do you see a tension there? How do you see that playing out?
And let me ask you, keep the microphone. Do you think that's positive, essentially, what you've just described?
Oh, certainly. These things, self-interest, mutual self-interest, people that see similarities between themselves and the person on the other side are less likely to resolve their conflict by, unfortunate means, if you will.
All right, we'll park that. Societal, please, to your right, someone else put up their hand. Please. I'm sorry, I can't see you very easily, but...
Probably good you can't see me. Rick Johnston, I run International Government Affairs for CitiBank. The question is simple. Technology and demographics, and particularly referencing the role of women in business. These are revolutionary developments that I think are requiring massive degrees of adaptation. And I'm very interested as to how our panelists view the role of those two factors in what we're having to
Thank you very much
contend with.
indeed. Let's keep the ideas coming, and please just attract the attention of whoever's got the microphone. But let's pick up, we were going to talk about this anyway, but let's bring it forward to society, the societal implications, the globalization, society wanting one thing. But Mohamed, you talked a year ago about the middle class shrinking, for example, about that being a massive, massive challenge to the societal assumptions that we make. How do you see what is happening and the societal pressures, particularly on leaders, to handle this and what the expectations are?
So let me get there via Rick and then Scott's question. Rick, whatever we discuss today, there's going to be three really big overarching issues: technology, climate change, demographics. And no matter what we discuss, these three things are going to play out. And the question is, when do they play out and in what magnitude? Which takes me to Scott's question. The empowerment of the individual via technology has huge upsides, but also has potential risks. For businesses, the reality is your consumer is expecting anywhere, anytime, anyhow client relationships. That's what the combination of mobility, big data, and AI empower the consumer to expect. So businesses have to adapt to that's what the consumer will increasingly be looking for. Where it causes clashes is, does the governance system evolve quickly enough to accommodate that, or does it seek to frustrate that? Because it's a shift of power to the individual. Now, all that is happening in a fascinating environment. If you think of distributions, and we normally think in terms of a bell-shaped distribution, what's known as a normal distribution. That is a very comforting distribution. The middle anchors the distribution. The tails exist, but they're very thin. So the distribution is relatively stable. What we're witnessing and what Nik has referred to is whether it is economic, financial, demographics, societal, or political, the middle of the distribution now is being hollowed out. We know about the pressure on the middle class around the world. Politically, the pressure on centrist parties. It is very difficult today to be a centrist party in a liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. The extremes do much better. So economically, it is very difficult to be a mid-sized firm. In technology, it's almost impossible to find a mid-sized firm these days. You're either a startup or you're big tech. So wherever you look, these distributions are being hollowed from the middle. And the minute they get hollowed from the middle, they become unstable. And that's the reality with which we're going to be operating with for a while.
We've tried to bring those two questions together, Ken and Willem. What do you think about both those issues, but particularly just building again, we were going to talk about this anyway, the way society is having to change, probably at a pace which exceeds the ability of politicians to catch up and grip the enormity of what's happening, Ken?
Well, some people say that we're in this period of stagnation, secular stagnation, and there's not a lot of innovation, and we're not going to grow fast because of that. I strongly disagree with that from a scientific point of view. I think there's spectacular innovation, artificial intelligence, tech, but it's exactly the problem you say, Nik, that it's difficult for our societies to adjust. And in particular in tech, I just think it's completely unresolved how to deal with social media, the impact on politics, amplifying the extremes, the information sharing. That's actually quite an issue between China and the United States. but it's also an issue between private citizens in the United States and the big tech companies. The question of how to handle all these challenges is really incredibly formidable. Our politicians are, really struggling with it. So, in fact, the problem is not that things have moved too slow, but they've moved so fast, and everything has changed overnight in ways that are very, very difficult for people or politicians to adjust to. And certainly, I think very eloquent about what Mohamed El-Erian said about, and Willem, about the hollowing out of the middle class is also one of the things, in addition to tech, that's made it hard to be a centrist. I regard myself as a centrist. I try to be apolitical, but I feel a little bit like someone growing up in Los Angeles. If you don't belong to a gang, everyone beats you up. And it's just very hard to be a centrist today. And of course, at the end of the day, speaking, maybe in my own interest, but we need centrists to reach consensus. We're not going to get an extreme solutions to our problems, not within a country, and certainly not globally. We need to reach compromises. One of the problems with the U.S. first policies is it's an extreme policy. That's just not how it's going to be at the end of the day. The United States needs to compromise. The United States needs the rest of the world. And you can't come to compromises when you tell everybody, we're just doing things for ourselves, we're great, we don't need anybody else. And we live in a world where that's very challenging.
Could I put on the agenda, apart from the fact that there's no gang culture in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I assume, unlike what you're yearning for in Los Angeles, but that particular message that you've just given, which it seems to me we should be putting on the G20 agenda, which is the amplification of extremes, the challenges for societies now, quite apart from the economics, the challenges for societies. There's a kind of amber warning, almost a red warning coming from the platform. Willem?
Yeah. The notion that sort of technical progress, in the sense of fundamental new technical innovations, has ground to a halt or is slowed down, is, I think, a nonsense. The problem is that the embodiment of all these new technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, genetic engineering, the embodiment of that in people and processes requires time and investment, which we are not sufficiently dedicated to. I mean, even in the advanced economies, even in the most advanced economy in the world, the US, there is, I think, massive underinvestment in education. The secondary level in the US, the quality of education is very uneven, and at the university level, there are these islands of unbelievably good excellence, which are completely unaffordable, and then a very wide range of institutions of highly heterogeneous qualities. So the potential, I think, to make a brighter and exciting future, the hyperglobalization society was referred to, right, is there, but it will require considerable additional investment in education, learning, as well as political changes that make this hyperglobalization real by, for instance, not getting to a situation where, despite the opening of the entire world to social media, immigration is becoming more restricted. So there are a lot of legal obstacles that get in the way of the potential advantages of modern technology.
Mohamed.
I need to ask this from my colleagues. You talk about all these innovations, and as you know, there's a view out there that my daughter spending her time on Instagram and TikTok doesn't, add to growth in the world at all. Ken, you wrote a really provocative article for Project Syndicate a few years ago that said that if you look at every major technological innovation wave, there's a lag. And we shouldn't worry too much about productivity numbers being sluggish or even coming down. It's only a matter of time. Can you update us a little bit about your view of where the matter of time is now?
I have to say, I gave a talk not long ago to the American Academy of Sciences. It has biologists, physicists, chemists, and it actually wasn't about this topic. But the question came up about what the view was about the future of technology. And I said, well, if you go to the major central banks, if you look a lot of economic research journals, the IMF, the basic story is it's over. We had 250 great years of innovation at the countries at the frontier like the United States. It's over. Other countries will eventually catch up. Then it'll be over for them too. And they all looked at me like, you're joking, right? That's actually what the experts in economics think? Don't they know that William Shockley discovered the transistor in 1948, but they didn't figure out how to use it until really the late 70s and early 1980s? And they gave me a host of other examples and told me about all these innovations. I think the problem is much more adjusting to the change. There have been many studies of this where electricity is invented, and it actually doesn't have that big an impact right away because it takes businesses time to think of how to use it. Our factory, our businesses are just going to be completely different when the railroad was invented. And I think that's true, particularly with artificial intelligence, which is, I think, the really big innovation that's coming. But I have to say, I have been saying this for a few years, and the numbers haven't changed yet. But I do feel some of what's going on is the aftermath of the financial crisis has just scared people, led to some of this populism, which has made businesses retrench. People are hesitant to invest. And so if you need to invest to exploit these things, not necessarily in heavy equipment, but as you say, in people and ideas. And one other point, and maybe probably something to talk about later in our conversation, of course, education is at the forefront of trying to adjust, of having inclusivity, of having less inequality, of enjoying productivity. And if you want to find one place where there's been very little innovation, it's education. I used to joke, and it wasn't far off, that when they told me a classroom at Harvard was wired, it meant that it had electricity. And if you go to a classroom today, I think a lot of them, if I don't tell you what year it is, you are not going to know. Like if you have to pick 1990, 2000, you're just not going to know. And again, there have been these innovations in how we could communicate information. And I don't just mean to young people, I think to everyone. There's no reason that education has to be thought of as something that's just for young people anymore. But it requires a complete rethinking, reorganization. And of course, when I'm talking about other industries, I always complain about unions and entrenched interests. There's certainly very strong entrenched interests in education that don't want to see these changes.
So you're both professors. What happens if you go and say, I believe in the upside down classroom, that the lecture that I can deliver, you students can get much better via video in the evening and come to the classroom and we'll spend the next hour and a half solving issues. So turn the classroom upside down.
So you're about to be a professor too.
No,
let's
but
be
you,
but,
so tell me, what
there-
happens if you do that?
So here's the issue. There's a lot of discussion of that in online courses. And the thing is, the way you would want to do education once you're shifting paradigm is different. The average online lecture, I don't know if any of your children have watched one or you have, it's like watching a ransom video. It's incredibly boring. It's not made interesting. And the length of time still exactly what it would be if you were sitting in a classroom. It's ridiculous. If you look at and this is maybe a weak analogy, but between movies and TV, movies have to be a certain amount of time in order to coordinate time slots. And television, at least in the United States, has just wiped out the movie industry because it's much more flexible. You can have short programs, you can string them together. I actually think the future of education is in using much more varied length depending on what the issue is, how you put them together. So that's not being done. You're calling what you're speaking on. It's called the flipped classroom, where you do the video, and it's not just investment, but thinking how to do it. There's various resistance. It would probably take a few years taking off from your teaching to really think how to do it. And so far, that hasn't been happening.
All right, let's park education for a moment if we can. And you're going to be president of a Cambridge college from October. So we look forward to how you're going to generate a real change in a place like Cambridge. And there was some applause there, which you may not have heard, Ken, to something you said. But I'm just going to pick up again another thing to take away. Populism has made people retrench. Populism has made people retrench. We call it in our project pushbackism, the people pushing back. We've got a lot of people who want to come in, but before I bring them in, I just want to nail down one thing, which was said earlier, I think, by Mohamed, the weaponization of economic tools. We are seeing that certainly led by the United States. We're seeing the United Kingdom is now moving in a different direction with its relationships, unbundling arrangements because of Brexit. But how much are other countries now having to learn the basics of guerrilla warfare, of economic tools now being weaponized in a way which they had not expected? Are they learning fast?
Well, it is my hope that they won't learn.
Yeah, but they have to survive and they have to exist and they have to adapt.
Well, I think we're going to have to turn, if we have any hope, to the institutions that are supposed to maintain order, like the WTO with its 164 members, right? And try and get it functional again. I mean, at the moment, the dispute resolution process is not functioning because the US has blocked the appointment of new judges. So even if you wanted to settle a dispute in a peaceful way, you can't do it, right? So there clearly are simple and obvious steps which could be taken, depending on the outcome of the election, that may make it less likely that you get a global weaponization of...
well, let me press it harder and say it's becoming fashionable now to challenge. And that's what you put on the agenda, and it's weaponized in your view, Mohamed. Do you see...
So let's understand why we got here. And I am in a very unusual situation. Normally, I'm the most pessimistic of a panel. I'm relatively optimistic compared to my colleagues.
I hope they're all being realistic.
So let's understand why we got here. Trade is inherently a cooperative situation. You and I decide to trade. We agree, I offer something, you offer something. We decide on what the right price will be. And then we set up a system that deals with grievances. That is a cooperative. In game theory, that is a cooperative game. The Trump administration said there have been long-standing grievances that not only we have, but also others have about certain behaviors and practices by China. Willem mentioned them. intellectual property theft, forced transfers of technologies, unfair subsidization. So the decision to weaponize economic tools was made in the process of saying the cooperative game is not working. So I am now going to play an uncooperative game. I am going to go and unilaterally weaponize my tools, and you're going to feel this in terms of tariffs and sanctions. Your first reaction is to say, you're going to do this to me, I'm going to do this to you. That's what happened with Mexico and Canada first. And then there's the realization that in this game, while both of us suffer, you suffer a lot more than I suffer. Because I, the US, am relatively closed. And if I can convince you, which the Trump administration has done, that I am willing to incur damage, you will make concessions. Mexico made concessions. Canada made concessions. China has made some concession in phase one, not major ones, but some. And I agree with what Ken said in the beginning, that it's not as impactful as some people would like it to be. But there's a question mark as to whether you go back then to a voluntary cooperative game or not. I don't know. As I said, the probabilities are more likely that you don't, but there is a good outcome possible, right? If the game resets with better practices with intellectual property theft. So I think that you have to understand where this weaponizing. The problem is once you weaponize, the national security people get interested. And they say, oh, wait a minute, we can use this for non-economic purposes. And that's very difficult to counter.
What I'm trying to get to is you're talking about China and the United States, but we're seeing this with the European Union as well. But weaponizing suggests conflict and tension becoming exacerbated by weapons, which, however you define those weapons. Is this really a very serious challenge now, Ken and Willem?
Well, first, I think there occasionally is a little spark of light, even in my otherwise dark world. For instance, the US, the EU, and Japan have called together for tougher WTO curbs on government subsidies and other forms of state aid. And that's unusual because we have the US, the EU, and Japan actually singing from the same hymn sheet for a while, and then also they're doing it through the WTO. And this could be something that it's aimed at China, of course, and it's one of these WTO type arrangements where unanimity is not required, and if only the big boys and girls play together, you could get something coming out of that. So there is hope, but
what about smaller nations, middle-sized nations who don't really have the economic weapons, who are becoming potentially victims of this?
I think they will either have to hang together or hang separately, right? And I think the small nations are vulnerable in this game because they have very little bargaining power.
Okay, Ken, and then I'm going to go to many more questions out there.
Let me make 2 points. I mean, sort of a question in general is how the B20 relates to the G20. There are many issues. There's nothing more than trade. If they talk to their population, it's just very appealing politically, no matter what the political system, to say you're closing your economy. I think most people don't understand comparative advantage. They don't understand trade, and it's a winning political strategy. I think you can get in most countries 80% of people to think it's a great idea. Businesses understand, and that's an area where they can push back. In terms of global trade conflict, I think in general, everyone has expressed, every country, including China, has exercised enormous patience with the Trump administration, not striking back any harder than they have to in order to move forward. But I know this is going to seem like a separate issue, but it's the same. I think climate change is going to present some big issues. The European Union is thinking very hard, and I think it's coming, about a border carbon tax.
Yep.
And this is going to blow up the global trading system. It may be well-intentioned. So basically, if you haven't followed this, they feel that they have a price on carbon. Everyone should have a price on carbon. And if you don't have a price on carbon, you have an unfair competitive advantage in your trade, and you should be taxed on goods you try to import into the European Union if you do this. And this is, it's not obvious how this fits into the WTO. In the United States, we don't have much leadership in that area at all, but yet, there's a possibility that we have a radical regime change in the US in 2020, and this could appear very suddenly. So this is on top of the kind of arbitrary trade friction.
Can I just press that issue of the adaptability of middle and smaller nations to this weaponization?
Well, I mean, it's a disaster for the smaller nations. We live in this world of global supply chains where they've set up with certain rules of the game in mind, understanding of certain institutions. So the countries that have suffered the most from the trade war are not China, not the United States, but smaller nations, Hungary, Singapore, countries which are very, very vulnerable to perturbations in this. And I don't have an easy governance answer to this. Willem said hang together. That's done to some extent in the WTO. You have some power to do that, but it's very challenging.
All right, well, help set the agenda. I know there are several people out there and several questions already. Let a gentleman here first, and then right at the back, I can see you, the paddles are going up, please. And introduce yourselves, please.
Good morning, my name is Yasser Mufti. I'm head of strategy for Saudi Aramco. I think the panel started off rather pessimistically.
What about realistically? What about realistically rather than
I want to be realistic, and I actually want to be a little bit optimistic. After all, we've seen such wonderful change here in Saudi Arabia. We are in Riyadh. That I think there's a case for being optimistic about the future. I agree that uncertainty and the problems that you talked about are not states that companies, businesses would desire to be in. No company looks for uncertainty to be a state that they operate in. But I do think that we need to be a bit more reflective on some of the trends that we had. Globalization was on an unsustainably fast pace. It created a lot of imbalances that we've had to deal with. We've also, I think, failed to see that while we do have uncertainty, there are opportunities, plenty of opportunities, I would say. Companies that have risk appetite, companies that have strong balance sheets, companies that are willing to invest in innovation, companies that are willing to invest in addressing their own carbon footprint. I think these companies are well positioned into the future. So yes, there are disruptions in supply chains. There are lots of changes, but I would go back and say that there is hope for the B20 community from the G20 countries. If they were to reflect on what strengths could we bring to the table, go back to the basics of economics. What are my comparative advantages compared to other producers in the same area? And we talk about retrenchment of goods and services in global trade. If you look at data and information flows across companies, across countries, it's just exploded. That is a new commodity. Companies that digitalize, companies that invest in that, I think will be well positioned for the future. So allow me to push back and say I think there is a glimmer of hope. There's lots of hope, I think, but it requires a different mindset and it requires a lot of work.
Let me just check. What's your view about the pause button on globalization?
I think it's definitely slowed down, but I would argue that there is significant growth that we've seen in data and information, and that in a way completes and offsets the growth that we've seen in conventional areas. So yes, we've seen a slowdown.
All right, a little more hope, please, gentlemen. Right at the back, please. Again, I can't see you, so introduce yourself.
Hi, this is Ali Ibrahim, representing Al Baraka Banking Group. I head up sustainable finance and sustainability at the group. Fascinating discussion, and I particularly love the focus on inclusive growth.
Are we too pessimistic?
Yes and no, of course. But then connecting to the first reference to unusual uncertainty. And I think the uncertainty is playing at multiple levels. One is the global level, the macro level, and also at the micro level where the billions are struggling to survive every day. And we all already know, particularly looking at the World Economic Forum's latest report on risk, all the top 5 risks are environmental related. We know what is coming. What we don't know or we less know is how to respond to that. And I think that unusual uncertainty is particularly more damaging. And then if we nuance that further, the populism is ripping us apart. All what we need right now is a united global response to the challenges that are looming, and most of them we already know. But then how do we take care of the populism without solving the income inequalities? And I think that's where we need to make more focus on that. And I really love the inclusive growth focus of this B20. So the businesses can proactively look to be part of the solution than just identifying what is looming. Because we humans, we have evolutionary praised ourselves that we are better than that. But I think the inclusive growth challenge and the income inequality is really putting the real challenge to us.
Inequality, right. Thanks for putting that on the agenda. We were going to talk about it anyway. There are 3 or 4 people at the front. Is there anyone else at the back? Please, let's let the microphone go along here. Who's got the microphone first?
Hi, I'm Phil O'Reilly. I chair business at OECD. But as you'll hear from my accent, I come from one of those small countries that you think might be at risk, New Zealand. One of the smallest and most isolated and most open economies in the world. We're here at an advocacy meeting. The B20 is about advocacy. And as I listen to your comments, I'm worried that we might all be victims of the politicians, and I don't like being in that position. I'm interested in what you think business CEOs in this room might be able to do to start pushing back on some of those kinds of problems and not being victims. Just for example, I think that business people have been far too polite about what's been going on in the world. I think we've done a poor job at reaching out to stakeholders like our employees and our customers and the communities which we serve, saying, this is what we think and here's why we think it's important. I'm interested in your thoughts about how we might do a better job of pushing back on some of these headwinds.
And you come from a country where your prime minister is popular, but her party is doing badly in the polls. A paradox.
Welcome to politics, but at least in New Zealand we still go towards the centre. I don't know how for long that will be, but it's a centrist political system in our country.
Okay, please, next.
Thank you very much. This has been an enlightening and very thoughtful panel so far.
Are we too pessimistic, too optimistic?
Well, let me first say who I am. I'm Stormy Milton with the Federation of German Industries, and I'm the former B20 Sherpa under Germany. So if you ask if there is a rewind or a stop, I would say it's a rewind, although it's not quite clear in all the data yet, the investment flow data, for example. But if we talk to our companies, there's definitely a change of global value chains. And we fear that there will be 2 different markets developing, one on the North American continent and Europe, and the other one on the Asian continent and China. And the reason for this is not, although we always look at tariffs, it's not the tariff issue. It's the other policy instruments which are being used, the weaponization of trade. It's export control, for example. It's things like the entity list in the United States. And these do change global value chains. And that, for me, is a sign of deglobalization. And my question to the panel is, how do we change that again? Because as soon as decisions are being made about where you produce, where you set up your networks, your trading and value chains, it's really hard to get back out of this. So my question to the panel is, what would you recommend companies to do with regard to these developments, which are not leading to more efficiency because they do not represent comparative advantages?
Are you from the BDI?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good. But you're in a country where there's now a degree of recession. How much in a country of plenty do you think those who voted in the election recently understand the enormity of what we've been hearing from the panel and all these terms, balkanization and so on? Or is there kind of a complacency that this is a blip and somehow it'll go away?
No, it's not a blip. I mean, we have had
Yeah, but I'm talking about public perception here.
Public perception is a really big issue. And we had that problem during our TTIP debates and TTIP negotiation. Very few people understand what trade is about and how it benefits everybody through jobs, through education, through technology change and so on. And I do have to agree that we also have to do our homework in the business community more to take along and to explain better what trade is about.
Can I put a word to you?
Sure.
Complacency on this. In other words, there's an assumption that actually this is just a cyclical problem and it'll come back strongly.
Yeah, let me give you an example. When we had those TTIP debates with the wider general public, and we argued, well, it's going to lead to more jobs. People said, we do have already enough jobs. If we said it's going to lead to more diversity and you can choose from more products, they said, we have more than enough products to choose from. So I think it had also something to do with our position that we were doing pretty well and that we are a society of plenty. But if the growth prospects are changing, if the unemployment data might change, there might be a different outlook on globalization. Having said that, it doesn't mean that we don't have to do a lot more with regard to.
And I'm pushing at that relationship between the public who vote for politicians, where the politicians in your country are complacent, even after the election recently. And I think you saw something which was in the middle ground being ripped apart in some ways. Now, who's next, please? And anyone at the back? I want to get more and more ideas because it'll help fuel up Linda's discussion after the coffee as well.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you very much. My name is Usama Al-Kurdi. I'm a businessman from Saudi Arabia. And I would like to add two elements to the uncertainty that were raised by your panelists. But first, I don't like the word adaptation. In my opinion, it is not strong enough.
What do you think it should be?
The private sector of the world needs to create something a lot more aggressive to deal with the changes in the business environment. Paradigm shift may explain it a little bit more than adaptation. The point I wanted to raise was...
What's the word you'd use?
I would use paradigm shift. I think it's major because what is required in terms of the changes that are happening in the business environment, I'm not going to repeat them because they were covered by your panelists, requires a lot more than just simple adaptation. Now, my point is that one of my points is the complete loss of the role of the WTO. Mm-hmm. It was an organization that the businesses can relate to. They can understand, they can appreciate, they can anticipate what is happening in the business world. But with the failure of the WTO to adapt and maybe even reinvent itself, that has created even more uncertainties for the business communities of the world. My second point is the increased participation as part of the uncertainty of the future is the increased participation of governments in business. Case in point, China. But unfortunately, many emerging markets are doing the same thing. There are more and more governments involved in investing, in actually almost crowding out the private sector of the world and creating an uneven field for competition in the business area. And so I think what is happening here might even create more uncertainties for the businesses around the world.
Thank you very much indeed. I know I'm giving you a lot, but I want to hear very much the views here. So if you can stack up, and also it'll bleed, I think, as well, Linda, into your session with some other areas. Please, on microphone.
Good morning, everyone. This is Ahmed Kiswani. I'm a partner in PwC. My question actually is related to the unusual uncertainty that Mr. El-Erian was mentioning at the early session. Basically, if we look to the financial crisis that happened in 2009, and a lot of reactive approach happened during that time, especially from many of the governments by issuing, we call it tsunami of regulations that has been issued as a reaction of that financial crisis. My question, within these uncertainties, what types of proactive roles and proactive approaches governments and inclusive economies could play as a precautions and proactive activities to face such uncertainties, especially that these uncertainties, we agree that is unusual uncertainties. Thank you.
That's underpinning everything we're talking about here. I think there's one person there, please, on another panel over there.
Yes, good morning. My name is Marco Felizati. I'm the B20 Chairman of the Italian Federation of Industry. My point to the panel is the following. For sure, I see two main disruptive elements coming over the scene recently that are basically extraterritoriality on the one side and national security on the other. Still, this being said, I'm reluctant to see any such golden age where trade and investment partners were undergoing on a cooperative basis. I rather tend to think that a great part of the international community has put a lot of dust under the carpet, and the WTO itself was largely ineffective since its very birth. So my point in the end is, instead of looking on how to go back to a situation which I don't see as a comfort zone, our effort should be devoted to shape a completely new paradigm. And yes, in this framework, with a fully functioning WTO, where there is a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. We've had two interventions there, one more over there, but particularly, gentlemen, on the new paradigm, a new paradigm needed, a new model needed. Please, who's got the microphone here? And then I'm going to come to the panel, because otherwise they'll forget what you've all been saying.
Hello, thank you. My name is Margaret Ann Splon. I'm the Executive Director of the Climate Markets and Investment Association, not-for-profit trade association outside of, based in London. I'm also the active private sector observer at the United Nations Green Climate Fund, which means that I sit in and provide private sector expertise and insight to the board decision making.
Can I just make a point?
Yeah.
Would you mind if I just say this? Climate change and sustainability is central to what we need to talk about. Can I ask you just to pause on that, because I'm not going to forget it. But I think there are some other issues which have come up, and I'm going to come to you immediately afterwards. But Ken particularly has put on the agenda, and I've just come from Abu Dhabi from the sustainability meeting there. This is absolutely crucial. So can I just ask you to pause for a moment on that, because then we can talk green in the next block, if you like.
Yes, we can, but that was one of my points. The world is currently acting in silos, and we as the business community need to come together and talk about sustainable trade, sustainable finance, sustainable digitalization. So the very fact that the policymakers act in silos means that we as the business community, I would argue, need to come together and provide innovative solutions. There's no lack of money in the market, but there's a lack of money flowing into proper sustainable finance. But we can come back to this.
Thank you very much indeed for your understanding there. Gentlemen, there's a lot there, but particularly on the new paradigm, particularly on the urgency of thinking in a different way, of acting in a different way. Willem.
An urgent need to get to sustainable trade, sustainable finance, is to strengthen both domestic fiscal capacity and global cooperation on fiscal matters. Ken mentioned that people don't understand competitive advantage and the gains from trade. Well, even if you do, and even if trade, as it does most of the time, increases the size of the pie, there almost always are losers in the trade game. And unless you have a robust domestic fiscal capacity to compensate the losers through explicit distributional measures, there's likely to be growing political opposition to trade agreements that will be potentially welfare enhancing if these domestic redistributive mechanisms were present. But it's also important to have these agreements at the international level, because domestic fiscal capacity has been severely inhibited by international tax competition. Tax havens and competition on corporate income tax rates have eroded the global corporate income tax base. It's extremely difficult to get an agreement on something as obviously necessary as a digital tax that taxes companies that have no physical presence in a country but make a vast amount of money there. So the need for countries to work individually on strengthening the domestic fiscal capacity to compensate losers and to cooperate across borders to broaden the tax base is absolutely essential if we want to have a chance at creating sustainable trade and finance.
Thank you. Now look, there are a lot of things, Mohamed and Ken and Willem come in as well. Opportunities and risk, for the view from Aramco. The incredibly important issue of inequality, which is getting worse with the hollowing out of the middle ground, that billions struggling to survive. But above all, this issue of the pressure from populism and also the definition of risk and how risk can be handled by leaders both in government and in business, given that risk and uncertainty are being exacerbated, and the urgent need for an appeal there for a much more proactive role on many of these issues. I think I've covered everything which we've heard in those 8 questions. Okay, Mohamed first.
And let me just thank the audience, because your comments are incredibly insightful. And there's a common thread underpinned by this notion of paradigm change as opposed to adaptation, and I agree with you. Let's start with our German colleague. She rightly said that the inclination of many countries is to think of the world in terms of 2 poles. A North American pole that you service and an Asian pole that you service. And if you happen to be based in North America, the phrase I'm hearing American businesses say more and more that have presence in China is yes, in China, for China. So we're not going to have supply chains that go out. We're going to produce mainly in China for China. So that left to its own, that's where the system goes. Which brings me to our colleagues from New Zealand, Phil. Where you are, and Australia and Singapore, the one question they don't want to answer is make a choice. Make a choice. Why? Because if you're Australia, if you're making a national security choice, you opt for the US. You're part of the Five Eye intelligence, you have the security blanket, but if you make an economic choice, you opt for China. And the last thing you want, and I would argue a lot of Middle Eastern countries don't want that question, is make a choice. So when you look at the third countries issue, the worst thing that can happen is where they have to make a choice. Mm-hmm. And technology is at the forefront of this, because technology involves a lot of national security issues. Which leads me to our colleague from Aramco, Yasser. You answered a lot of the questions, because you said first, it's about having a reform story. Vision 2030 is a reform stories. Unfortunately, there are very few reform stories around. I can count probably on the fingers of one hand how many meaningful reform stories are going on around the world. The world has become very short-termism. There isn't this medium-term and long-term vision that's needed. So one element is to be in a place where there is a reform story going on, which has a destination and has a journey to that destination. Mm-hmm. And in terms of what businesses can do, well, Aramco shows what businesses can do. I've gotten to know Aramco better over the last few years. What they've done on the environment is incredible, especially given that they are an energy company. What they've done with social responsibility is incredible. What they've done in terms of retooling and retraining the workers, and what they've done in the sense of understanding that the stakeholders go beyond your direct stakeholders and include the community. Which leads me to the last thing, which is ultimately, in order to engage and in order to influence, and remember, there's a whole range of things. You can either inform someone else's agenda, you can influence someone else's agenda, or you can impose on someone else's agenda. Businesses will never be able to impose on government's agendas, but they can inform and influence. But in order for you to be able to inform and influence, you've got to be in a strong position. And it takes three things to be in a strong position in this world. Resilience. You have to be able to navigate through the unusual uncertainty. Balance sheet is clearly the most important element of resilience, but it goes way beyond that. You have to be able to afford mistakes, because you will end up making a mistake. No one wants to make a mistake, but when everything changes around you, the chances of a mistake goes up. Second, optionality. You have to be able to change your mind as more information becomes available. By definition, uncertainty means that you will have to adapt. And the final thing is what we heard is this notion of agility. Able to move when the environment changes and as the environment changes. I think those three things ultimately, and we can talk about what it takes for businesses and governments to have it, but ultimately that is going to help you deal with these paradigm changes ahead of us.
And 30 seconds, Mohamed, before I go to Ken. How agile, how resilient, how adaptable, how nimble do you think most businesses are?
They're not, the average is well below what's needed, and then there's a massive tail of distribution on that.
Okay, Ken, pick up on all those points, including inequality, if you could, please.
I first want to start out really with the first speaker, I think from Saudi Aramco, who was very eloquent and I think very right about things change for the better too. It's, you know, at least I speak for myself. I'm an economist and kind of trained in thinking of everything that can go wrong. These are, you know, your business people who, you know, move forward. And there have been, and I'm not young, and there have been just remarkable changes in my lifetime that I just couldn't have imagined. And certainly the reforms going on here are remarkable. That's, you know, something I wouldn't have predicted or expected. And yes, it can happen in other places. And so, you know, it is easy to get too pessimistic when there are, you have to remember there's a balance and things can go in both directions. I think the link between inequality and trade is a very important one. I know my country the best, but I think it's true of almost everybody. The pressures on leaders to put on various kind of trade obstacles, trade barriers are enormous. They're constant. They're being lobbied all the time, and they're very popular. My mother really did not like free trade. I mean, I'm an economist. She's a very smart woman and just did not like free trade. I couldn't talk her out of it. And the way that I think businesses push back is they tell the politicians, we're going to give you growth if you do this. If all the things you want, you can't have if we can't give you growth. And what's been difficult in this current period is growth's been very low. And so it's been harder to come in with that argument, just be patient. You'll be able to do so many things people will like if we give you free trade. And I think, sorry, is my microphone coming? That's been a big challenge. On a new paradigm, well, if I had a really great one, I wouldn't be here. I'd be madly writing about it somewhere. I worry that the paradigm shift we're going to get, at least in advanced countries, is not going to be a constructive one. It's going to be back to old things that didn't work and will work even less well. One of the participants from the audience made this point about how in many emerging markets, it's a very important point, the footprint of the government just gets bigger and bigger. Just as in say, the United States, monopolies getting bigger and bigger and bigger, I think those same forces are increasing the footprint of the government, and it makes it more difficult for the private sector to compete. Without naming names or going to details, some of the presidential candidates in the United States would really like to increase the footprint of the public sector. And I'm not political, I'm a centrist, but the paradigm shifts are utterly radical, and I'm pretty good friends with one of them and speak to this person's economic advisors, and they're very big on having a public option for everything and often not a private option. They're complicated issues. Again, I'm not expressing a political opinion, but only that there could be radical regime shift that might not be so good for businesses. And one way businesses need to bear in mind is there are these populist forces, and you need to bend. You don't want to change the system, but certainly the extremes that we've seen, we need to have some adjustment. And of course, things like education are important, but also finding ways that are market-friendly of responding to these inequalities rather than command and control. I think that should be the objective of businesses. That's what the objective in trade has been. There are going to be some tariffs. There are going to be some restrictions. Let's make them transparent, because it's a lot easier to deal with transparent policies than non-transparent policies. And I think it's very important for businesses to push on that margin.
Ken, as you have the microphone at the moment, you wrote that serially important paper about growth and debt. And you've just mentioned low growth, and all of you have mentioned low growth. Where do you think growth is going? Quickly, all of you, because I want to get on to climate change before 11 o'clock.
Quickly. So I'm among economists on the optimistic side about where the future of global growth is going. I think the financial crisis has taken longer to heal. People have been more nervous. And I think if you look historically, it's difficult to predict the next decade from the last decade. I think there'll be some improvement in the next decade. I do worry about the very high levels of private debt, especially in emerging markets, but also public debt, where we are absolutely in a fourth wave of debt growth in emerging markets, and it's not clear how it's going to end.
Let me just put to you about central banks as well, all three of you. The issue of whether banks are running out of any instruments now to do anything. Mark Carney in the Financial Times about a week ago said he's worried that the instruments available are almost running out, and he's not sure where he would turn if he remained governor of the Bank of England. Is there a consensus among you that the instruments available are pretty limited now if there were to be another 2008? Willem?
Well, the central banks in the advanced economies are low on fuel, to put it mildly.
So you're agreeing with Mark Carney?
Yeah, indeed. And the next time, even if they're not at zero lower bound yet, and they are, of course, already at zero lower bound in Europe and in Japan, the next cyclical downturn will put both the US and the UK back at a zero lower bound, where all you have are these unconventional measures, which, while they may have non-trivial effects on financial conditions, have very limited transmission to the real economy. So you need something else, and something else is fiscal policy. And I hope that should the time come, we will get the right fiscal responses, even in places like Germany. I'm not holding my breath, but that would be my hope. So I am in full agreement with Mr. Carney on that, yes.
Your breathing is on pause as well as your music as well, isn't it? Mohamed, your view.
So first, it's important to say that Ben Bernanke took a different view. Mm-hmm. Ben Bernanke said, no, we have plenty of ammunition. I agree with Mark Carney. I think that the effectiveness of monetary policy has declined, and if, God forbid, we hit a recession, then central banks will not be able to be as counter-cyclical as they have been in the past. Where I would go one step further is to say that in the case of the European Central Bank, it's not just a question of ineffectiveness, it's a question of counterproductive. That what the European Central Bank is doing today is counterproductive to long-term economic growth and is counterproductive to long-term financial stability.
Ken.
Well, we have a range of views on this. So I don't think fiscal policy is the answer to substitute for monetary policy. It's needed. But at least in most advanced countries, it's not something that's easily used as a surgical tool. Monetary policies worked because we've been able to isolate it in a technocratic institution. Having independent central banks has worked extremely well, even in many countries that we didn't imagine that it could. And I think part of how it works is taking a long-term view, isolating the decision from these very short-term things. Fiscal policy, and again, I'm sorry to keep using the United States, if the Republicans are in power, fiscal policy means cutting taxes as much as possible and making the government as small as possible. If the Democrats are in power, it means making the government as big as possible. What are businesses to do? Because it goes back and forth, who's going to be in power. The idea that this can be used as a surgical tool is really a joke. And I think central banks have been all pushing this idea, somebody else will do it. And in a few countries it'll work once, twice, but I don't think it's a long-term solution. Another conversation, but I think the long-term solution actually is negative rates. And I have to say, Willem was decades ahead of everybody in writing about this. And a thing to understand about if you use negative rate policy effectively, which is not being done today, is it's just the very short-term rates where that happens. The long-term rates go up because you create expected inflation, you create growth. I think that's absolutely 100% the future we're going to see with all the central banks, and they're all looking at it, and none of them want to talk about it.
Thanks, Ken. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes to run, and I said we'd keep the climate emergency to the end because I'm conscious as well, we've created a lot of spinning plates, and I apologize if not all the plates have landed yet, and probably many of you have got other things which Linda can pick up from the B20 perspective shortly. But let me get an understanding from all three of you about how much you think this enormous shadow of the climate emergency is almost being understated and under-injected into consideration of the importance for business now, the importance for the G20. There is public pressure, not just from Greta, but there's public pressure. I heard it yesterday in Abu Dhabi, very blunt pressure, which is saying, actually, from the next generation, we are not understood. And I saw Joe Kaeser, the chief executive of Siemens, after the problem of the Adani mine in Australia, where they've got an 18 million euro contract to provide the railway to this new mine, which has been given the go-ahead. He stood up there in front of a Youth for Sustainability gathering and said, what did we do? What could we do? It was a no-win situation. And he's now putting a sustainability committee into Siemens so that every single operation which they contract goes through a sustainability and next generation approval process. He was saying this without a script, just talking to the next generation saying, I understand your pain, but imagine we also had a contract which we had to keep to, and that's why we've had to go ahead with it. I put that through as one example of the real pressure that's now building from the public on the climate emergency, which in many ways is counterintuitive to traditional business activity. But as we've heard in Madrid and elsewhere, it's the business community who are ahead of the politicians. What's your view in the last 5 minutes before I hand over to Linda? Ken, you just nodded.
Well, this is building up incredibly in the public and therefore putting pressure on businesses. I have to say the issue is kind of complex because, for example, in Africa, only 50% of people have access to electricity. And so the pressures are very different. The immediate pressures versus the long-term pressures. I think a real tension is that the advanced countries have created a lot of the problem. A lot of the existing emissions come from the rich countries, particularly the United States. And yet the growth in emissions is coming from Asia especially, and from emerging markets. And the advanced countries are saying, you stop what you're doing, stop polluting. And the emerging markets are saying, but you're still polluting more per capita than we are, you did everything, why should we respond? So this is a very urgent issue. And I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to know what's coming really fast, Europe is going to put on a border carbon tax that's really going to set off an explosion in the global trade community.
And the Vice President Timmermans is being given 100 days to come up with a Green Deal.
Mm-hmm.
Willem.
No, climate change is the dominant problem already of this generation, certainly of the next generation. The public pressure and business pressure is growing, but the public response, the policy response, is extremely disappointing thus far. And I hope that Ken's prediction of a border carbon tax for the European Union comes true, because it would at least be a beginning of a first step towards a global carbon tax, which is an inherent part of any long-term solution. But I'm not holding my breath.
Mohamed.
So we started this conversation with whether globalization was on pause, rewind, climate change is on fast forward. Society has pressed fast forward on climate change in terms of awareness and advocating and pressing for the need to start catching up with an enormous problem. For businesses, for the reasons you heard already, you cannot wait and say it's someone else's problem, because the big solutions are very, very hard. And even if they're engineeringly possible, they have massive distributional issues, as you heard. So what I'm going to see is an acceleration of the evolution in business. You know, the evolution in business goes somewhere the following. In the very beginning, it's let's ignore it, or let's talk about it, but not do anything about it. Then it evolves into, it's a nice thing to do. And then it evolves into, it's the right thing to do. And now it's evolving into a must-do. And when you get through that evolution, you get to where the Siemens person is, where you go from playing defense to playing offense. Mm-hmm. It becomes part of your offensive reaction, offensive in terms of proactive reaction to what your impact on the rest of the world is. And I think business needs to realize that if you don't accelerate this internal transition, someone's going to force it on you. And when it's forced on you, it's going to be very different than when it comes out organically.
Thanks, Mohamed. We're out of time for this segment, but I just want to ask you, Ken, given your position at Harvard, does history help us on this or not? Do economic models help us on this at all? Does the conformity which got people to the top help them? Or have they got to shed so much?
That's a quick question. I'm going to just close it by saying, if you want to know, it's a big topic. We had the Harvard-Yale football game interrupted this year for hours by students protesting about climate change, and I think that's something we'll see much, much more of.
And history and the model?
I mean, I don't have a glib answer to that. This is a challenge of forcing nations to cooperate we've never seen. I mean, we've had it over conflict, we've had it over natural resources, but nothing at this scale with this footprint. I don't have a good analogy to that.
Thank you. We're just pausing for the moment. Linda, can I just introduce you? Would you like to come up? And then I can introduce, because we're moving now into a second segment after coffee and so on. So let's continue this spirit going. Linda Yu will be taking over my position to talk more about the B20, but some very significant phrases which have come out here. You don't have a microphone, Linda, but I just want to... Oh, you do? Okay. Is there anything particularly you want them to think about from what you've heard so we can keep the continuity going?
Fantastic job, Nick. And all the plates that are spinning, I want us in the next session to make those plates land. And so we know this afternoon there will be 6 different work streams focusing on key areas such as the future of education and work, energy, sustainability, finance, infrastructure. In that session, I want to talk about business advocacy. I want you to think in those 6 areas. What do you want from this fantastic panel to help you think about what kinds of things businesses can do to achieve those 6 areas and make the B20 agenda impactful and contribute towards achieving the overall G20 agenda. So get your thinking caps on even more. Look at those 6 areas. We will spend time on each of those, and I look forward to, hopefully, landing all those wonderful plates that you've already begun to spin for Nick.
And can you land here back in your seats in literally 30 minutes? Don't make it a long coffee break. Let's make it productive. Can I thank the panelists? They've got more work to do, but thank you.